Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, let's cross straight over to Malta now, where the European Council President Donald Tusk has begun speaking.
Because, as you know, the treaty gives us only 2 years to reach an agreement. Allow me to outline the main elements and principles of my proposal. We treat them as fundamental and will firmly stand by them. Our duty is to minimize the uncertainty and disruption caused by the UK decision to withdraw from the EU for our citizens, businesses and member states. As I have already said, in essence it is about damage control. We need to think of people first. Citizens from all over the EU live, work and study in the UK. And as long as the UK remains a member, their rights are fully protected. But we need to settle their status and situation after the withdrawal with reciprocal, enforceable and non-discriminatory guarantees. Second, we must prevent a legal vacuum for our companies that stems from the fact that, after Brexit, the EU laws will no longer apply to the UK. Third, we will also need to make sure that the UK honours all financial commitments and liabilities it has taken as a member state. It is only fair towards all those people, communities, scientists, farmers and so on, to whom we, all the 28, promised and owe this money. I can guarantee that the EU, on our part, will honour all our commitments. Fourth, we will seek flexible and creative solutions aiming at avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It is of crucial importance to support the peace process in Northern Ireland. These 4 issues are all part of the first phase of our negotiations. Once and only once we have achieved sufficient progress on the withdrawal, can we discuss the framework for our future relationship. Starting parallel talks on all issues at the same time, as suggested by some in the UK, will not happen. And when talking about our future relationship, we obviously share the UK's desire to establish a close partnership between us. Strong ties reaching beyond the economy and including security cooperation remain in our common interest. Let me conclude by saying that the talks which are about to start will be difficult, complex and sometimes even confrontational. There is no way around it. The EU27 does not and will not pursue a punitive approach. Brexit in itself is already punitive enough. After more than 40 years of being united, we owe it to each other to do everything we can to make this divorce as smooth as possible. This is also why Prime Minister May and I have agreed to stay in close and regular contact throughout this process. I intend to visit Theresa May in London before the April European Council. Thank you.
As rotating presidency, we see the guidelines that have just been submitted by President Tusk as constructive. It will be a very tough negotiation, an unprecedented negotiation for the European Union, since previously, in all such negotiations, it was about getting closer, not getting further away from each other. It will be a tough negotiation, but it will not be a war. At the end of the day, the two sides will need to remain close to each other as friends, but it is obvious for the 27 that membership of the European Union is the superior option. The priority as set out in the draft guidelines, which will now be discussed and are just now being discussed at Coreper level in Brussels, show very clearly that the first priority is the settling of the issues relating to citizens. We need to make sure that our citizens, European citizens in the United Kingdom and British citizens in the European Union, are not used as bargaining chips by any sides. So I do believe that there is a wide-ranging commitment to settle this issue as quickly as possible. As President Tusk was saying, and as already declared in our initial statements, 27 see no room for parallel negotiations. First, there needs to be an agreement on the principles of the United Kingdom's orderly withdrawal from the European Union. But once those principles are agreed, and before actually going on with those negotiations, once there is sufficient progress that will be determined by the European Council alone, negotiations on a new phase, a new relationship would be able to start by Council giving a mandate to the negotiator to do so. It is imperative to stress that while the European Union and the Member States are showing flexibility in making it clear that they are ready for transition periods as necessary, those transition periods need to be governed by European institutions, since those are the institutions that would be sovereign in taking decisions. Finally, the issue of Northern Ireland is being given serious and special consideration by the 27. We know the sensitivities that exist on the Irish issue, and we are looking at innovative, creative and pragmatic solutions to see that the peace and stability on the Irish Isle are maintained. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The one down.
Hello, it's Chris Morris from the BBC. President Tusk, your document talks about the fact that there will be no separate negotiations between individual member states and the UK. You've talked a lot about unity in the past week. This makes it sound like you're worried that the UK is going to try and pick off individual countries and have those kind of negotiations. How can you be sure that that won't happen? Secondly, the document also talks about you won't move on to a second phase of negotiation involving trade talks and future trade relationships until sufficient progress has been made in the initial phase. What does sufficient progress mean? And who is it? Simply the European Council that will define that? And Prime Minister Muscat, I value your thoughts on those issues as well. Thank you.
This is my first divorce, and I hope that the last one, it means that I have no experience at all. And this is why I want to be very cautious and precise. Let use my notes. But first of all, when it comes to our unity and solidarity, I have no doubt, especially after our summit in Rome and after our Rome Declaration, that this is not only a declaration, and for sure it is not a propaganda. This is the truth, that all 27 want and will be united during the negotiations. And I have no doubt that this is in our common interest, but also in the interest of the UK. If they want to achieve a constructive agreement, it means that they should discuss and negotiate only with the 27 as a unity. This is the only way to achieve anything during this very difficult process?
Well, from my side, it's obvious that the British government is in contact with all member states. I don't think that there is any instruction from Brussels or any institution not to have a regular and normal relationship with our British counterparts. We will continue to engage with the United Kingdom, and I think all member states will. But, and that this is a clear demarcation line, when it comes to negotiations on this issue, on Brexit and on future relationships, there is a clear commitment by the 27 to have just one point of contact, and that point of contact is Mr. Barnier. That negotiation is led exclusively from the European side by Mr. Barnier, and I do believe, as Donald has just said, that this is not something of a lip service, but this is a true political commitment from each side. When it comes to your question on sufficient progress, yes, we are seeing that the sufficient progress is determined exclusively by the European Council.
Yeah, I want to be very clear, and I want to support Joseph. It must be clear that the EU27 decides if sufficient progress has been achieved. Probably in the autumn. At least I hope so.
Okay. Second row. Behind you, behind you.
Thanks. Robin Emmett from Reuters. President Tusk, in the guidelines, there is envisaged some kind of transition period in which Britain would continue to pay into the EU budget and be under the jurisdiction of the ECJ. Both those things are the reasons why people voted to leave the EU. I wondered, why have you included them? Thank you.
Let me say just one thing about it, about money and some impressions on the both sides of the channel. There is no such thing as a Brexit bill or penalty for leaving. We want to talk just about fairness and commitment. I have no doubt that for both sides it's really important to demonstrate that we want to be fair to each other during the negotiations.
I will add to that there is no, as Donald was saying, Brexit bill. I think that the letter that Prime Minister May sent in itself acknowledges that the UK has commitments. So what we're setting out here in the draft guidelines, once they're agreed, but I think there is a broad agreement on the document that Donald has put forward, and okay, some things might be added, some things might be subtracted, but the essence is there. I do believe that the idea is one which shows and says that those commitments must be respected, and the idea is that we have to come out with a methodology that shows and calculates those commitments, and also what Britain needs to take from European assets, as in a clear balance sheet. So I do believe that this is very, very obvious. On the ECJ and other European institutions governing transition periods, in our books, transition periods means that you're still a member, or at least you still have access to a membership situation. If you have such an access, it is obvious, it goes without saying that the institutions we have all agreed upon need to govern that period. We will obviously not intrude on what happens afterwards within the United Kingdom. Then, when it comes to a free trade agreement, we will have to have negotiations, and those negotiations will then determine what type of institutions will govern that new type of arrangements.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Get them. Okay.
Nigel Mifsud from Television Malta. President Tusk, Prime Minister Muscat 2 days ago expressed his concern following Prime Minister May's letter on the link between the trade agreement and future security cooperation. Is this acceptable? And have you received any concerns from Member States about Prime Minister May's letters?
You know, especially after the terrorist attack in London, I mean the latest events, it must be clear that terrorism is our common problem and security is our common problem. I know Theresa May well enough and I know her approach to this issue. This is why I rule out this kind of interpretation and speculation that security cooperation is used as a bargaining chip. It must be a misunderstanding. Our partners are wise and decent partners, and this is why I'm absolutely sure that no one is interested in using security cooperation as a bargaining chip.
I would like to confirm that even though it was something that hit the headlines and really and truly many people, including ourselves, noted, we have had reassurances from the British government that this is a misinterpretation. We will take, at least my government will take, the British government's word. We do believe that they are decent partners, people who will not bargain on security of any of our citizens, and I do believe that we will start these tough negotiations in a spirit of sincere cooperation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that was the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, speaking there with the Maltese Prime Minister as well. They're live in Malta, talking, of course, about those Brexit negotiations. Interesting number of points he outlined there. He was saying there are absolutely not going to be conversations, parallel conversations about trade and commitments. Let's speak to our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus, who's in Brussels. Damien, interesting, he outlined those 4 areas that he wanted to get sorted, Donald Tusk, before we even contemplate a discussion about trade. Just take us through those, if you would.
Yes, I mean, this is what the EU side have identified as the most pressing issues to be settled absolutely first of all in this Article 50 exit process. There's been a lot of lobbying, and you see some of that in this. There's been lobbying from citizens, so EU citizens living in the UK, UK citizens living in the EU. That's number one priority, he said, to sort out their status, because those people have rights to live, to work, to study, and what will happen to those rights in the future. The second thing he talked about was preventing a vacuum of laws. That talks about businesses, what certainty will they have, EU, those, he said, who the guidelines which we have now here, talking about those benefiting from EU money, EU projects that are extending into the long term. That goes into the third issue, which is the UK's financial commitments. And he said, in fact, both sides must honour those. And very interestingly, Donald Tusk made the point that this isn't a Brexit bill. This is a settling of accounts because, he said, and I'm sure he did this deliberately to try to personalise it, he said this is payments promised to farmers, to scientists, and those are people that obligations have been made that must be met. And the last thing was the Northern Ireland border. We've seen a big effort by the Irish government to press this. That is identified as a key priority as well.
And briefly, Damien, there was recognition that these could be difficult conversations, sometimes confrontational. Donald Tusk said those words, but also talking about security cooperation. He felt there'd been a misunderstanding over this letter from Theresa May.
Yes, and he was saying it's absolutely, this is a common problem or a common priority to tackle terror, and that's something that must be done together. But I think there's one thing to take away from this whole thing, from this document, from what we heard Donald Tusk say, which is that the EU side is very clearly setting the agenda now. The a timetable the EU is setting, saying exit talks there must be sufficient progress on, and we heard them in that press conference saying it's the EU side, the 27, who will decide when that progress has been sufficient, when they are happy that enough detail has been nailed down on the exit agreement, that they will move on to the future relationship and a transition. Other things too, you heard the question from Reuters there, making very clear again that from the EU side, if there is a transitional period during which the UK continues to access the single market, it will be on the EU's rules, they were saying. Payments into the EU budget, the rules of the Court of Justice applying, the EU absolutely clearly laying down its principles there, I think. And we're now going to see the EU in trying to enforce what it sees as how this negotiation must proceed. And Donald Tusk very clearly said that a person or people in the UK have been advancing the idea of parallel negotiations on a future status for the UK along with the withdrawal agreement. The person who's been advocating those is the UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, and he said absolutely that will not happen. A very clear message from the EU, who now I think are going to be in control of a lot of the dynamic of this.
Damien Grammaticus in Brussels, thank you very much. Well, let's speak to our political correspondent, Ian Watson, who's in Westminster. So, Ian, is this a rebuff to Theresa May?
Well, the language from Donald Tusk has been described, I think, as firm rather than anything else. But we heard from him himself saying, look, at times these talks are going to be confrontational. And when it comes to rebuff, well, just remember this. This is what Theresa May asked of the European Union, European Council, of which Donald Tusk is president, in her letter triggering Article 50 this week. She said, we believe it is necessary to agree the terms of our future partnership alongside those of our withdrawal from the EU. And today Donald Tusk had said, almost in terms, no chance. There will be no parallel negotiations. What he said is the first phase will be about the untangling of Britain's relationship with the rest of the EU, and only then will they move on to a second phase, which will be looking at the future relationship, at trade and so on. But the people who will decide whether that second phase will be triggered will be the European Council themselves, not some independent body, not the UK, the European Council. And no final trade deal will be concluded until Britain has left the European Union. And in addition to that, if there's any transitional arrangements, then Britain would have to accept the same supervisory role as they do currently as an EU member. These are not things which Theresa May asked for. She certainly was in favour of a transitional deal, but she wants to leave the European Court of Justice, and she wants negotiations to run in parallel. Donald Tusk very clear that that would not happen in his view. Now, in the last few minutes, we've had a Downing Street reaction, a Downing Street statement following that press conference by Donald Tusk and following the publication of the draft guidelines. And in it they say these are only, effectively stressing, these are only draft guidelines. We look forward to beginning negotiations once they've been formally agreed by the full 27 remaining members of the European Union. And Downing Street goes on to say it's clear that both sides wish to approach the talks constructively. And as the Prime Minister said this week, we wish to ensure a deep and special partnership between the UK and the European Union. So Downing Street are doing absolutely nothing at this stage to fan the flames. They're saying, in effect, look, this is a negotiation and this is the opening salvo, but we hope we'll move on to more constructive talks later. And to be fair, there is the grounds for some constructive progress. For example, both sides clearly want, as an early priority, to sort out the status and the rights of EU citizens. They recognise that the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is something which requires special attention. But that key issue, can you have talks on trade going alongside, if you like, the divorce settlement, the bill we may have to pay to leave the European Union? They're in two different places. Theresa May wants them to happen together. Donald Tusk and the EU Council very clear today that they don't.
Ian Watson, thank you. Let's cross over from Westminster and head to Malta and speak to Chris Morris, our Europe correspondent. Chris, you were in that press conference with Donald Tusk. We saw you asking a question there. The tough talk has really started now, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I mean, cast your mind back 2 days, and Donald Tusk, when he appeared in Brussels brandishing Theresa May's letter, sounded really emotional, didn't he? Sounded genuinely upset. Today, it felt like it was all about business. You know, this is our response, and it's going to be tough. And there's a clear indication from this press conference, the big thought from it is that the EU now believes it is in control of the process. For 9 months since the referendum, Theresa May had the timing in her hands, but it was her decision when to trigger Article 50. Now that it's been done, it is the EU which says, right, we are going to set the tone. We're going to spend another month debating these draft guidelines, then have a summit of the 27 leaders to approve them, if possibly in slightly amended form. Then they've got to be turned into a formal negotiating directive. And only then will negotiations start, and they will have to start on our terms. Now, you could say, well, the UK say we don't accept that. But if the other 27 countries are united in saying divorce and separation first, and then when sufficient progress is made, and we will judge what sufficient progress means, then we'll move on to talk about the future. And only then, once we've made progress on that, will we talk about a transition from one to the other. That is the EU saying, this is our process, this is our treaty that this process is being done under, and we're now considering you in a cooperative way. Everyone's being very terribly polite and constructive, but in a cooperative way as a third country with which we are negotiating.
Chris Morris, live in Malta, thank you for speaking to us.